may have gleaned, this is going to be a webinar about payroll reimbursement. We are the Small Cities Assistance Program team. Most of you have been working with us pretty consistently over the course of the last several weeks. We're going to be walking you through a basic overview of the approval process of how it looks from our end, as well as some do's and don'ts to keep in mind while filing payroll reimbursement requests leading up to the December 8th final reimbursement deadline, which, as Ashanta mentioned, it's a pretty hard deadline, so you'd be much better suited reimbursing or submitting documents for reimbursement sooner rather than later so that we can get everything wrapped up by the deadline as opposed to starting things on December 7th.
I did also want to point out to Kat, before you dive too far in, why we decided to focus on payroll. The reason why we want to make sure that you understand the payroll process is, one, we've seen that one has the most potential for errors and people doing them in a variety of different ways. But also with payroll, we want to ensure that people are submitting requests that will get them the most of their money back as soon as possible. And payroll is a large expense for most cities. So by submitting your public health, public safety, and your EMS, fire, anything like that, those are 100% reimbursable. And you don't need to do the administrative burden of figuring out what time was spent on COVID. So we encourage you to use that before that. If you have other programs that you want to, or things you want to purchase, once you receive that money, it's yours to do what you wish with. But we encourage you to get the payroll because that's just an easy, fast way to get the most money quickly. Sorry, Kat. If you're not muted, can you please put yourself on mute? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ashanta. That's a really good point. And one thing that we've seen periodically with some cities is large expenses come up that are related to COVID, but maybe not related enough to guarantee reimbursement for that expense. If that's the case, payroll is a really good thing to look into because, like we've mentioned, we only reimburse money that's already been spent. So once you're approved for that money that's already been spent, we don't really care what you spend the money on. So just reach out to us. We can advise you on how you can get the most money possible with the fewest possible reimbursement requests. And as Ashanta mentioned, payroll is a large part of that for the most part. Moving into the presentation, this is an extremely basic overview that you're looking at right now of the Small Cities Assistance Program team's review process. So it's broken down into 4 parts. I'll be walking through examples from the different stages of the approval process using this overview, and you'll find a more detailed explanation of this process at the very end of our presentation. The deck's going to be sent out to participants, so feel free to reference the slides included in the presentation while applying for reimbursement going forward. So in essence, the 4 stages of our process are document review, matching requests to documentation, final validation, and document submission and upload. Document review contains, it's basically exactly what it sounds like, but we review documents to ensure that all necessary information is present. And we also do an initial scan of documents for any kind of recognizable flags that might be an issue later. So second, matching requests to documentation. That's where we get a little bit more granular and make sure all line items on the reimbursement request form, so basically the subtotaled items that lead up to the grand total of what you're requested or what you are requesting can be located in the supporting documentation. Final validation of request and documentation refers to the part of the process where between 2 and 3 members of our team perform essentially identical reviews of your documentation to make sure that more than one set of eyes gets on it and approves it. And finally, we submit that request to the county for final approval and payment. And in the process of doing that, we upload those documents to an auditor repository, so auditors have easier access to them. So I'm going to move through each of these stages in order and show examples of documentation done well as not so well. And then we can provide some general advice on best practices along the way.
Kat, I think we can't hear you if you are talking.
Sorry, it got muted. What was the last thing you heard?
We didn't hear anything on this slide.
Okay, sorry guys. All right. Okay, so before we jump in, there's three main categories of documentation that we need in order to approve the request. So keep these categories in mind when you're collecting and submitting relevant documentation to avoid what's basically unnecessary back and forth early on in the submission process. The first category is reimbursement request form, which you're all probably familiar with at this point. It contains two main things that I'm going to be going over. So there's scope of work, which on top of just being a general explanation of what it is that you guys are requesting for reimbursement, it explains why expenses are both necessary and related to COVID-19. There's also an itemized list of expenses that are submitted for reimbursement. It's important to keep in mind that these expenses and totals, as well as individual line items, have to be easily verifiable using supporting documentation. We'll get into that in more detail in a bit, so don't worry about it too much for now. As far as supporting documentation, there's generally several different options for providing the type of documentation that's required to prove that money was spent and that the expense is relevant to COVID, but it has to contain the following. So hours worked, information on employees, including names and or employee IDs, depending on what works better or what type of personally identifying information you guys are working with. Rate of pay for each employee, so whether they're hourly or salary, we still need to know what they're paid generally, and then proof of payment. So this is the one that we are missing most frequently in the first submissions from cities. So it's not enough to show that something was invoiced, you need to show that money left your account. So that can exist in the form of check registers, check stubs, anything like that. A third category that we've seen a lot that we didn't ask for explicitly at the beginning is quality assurance documentation. So that encompasses any notes, calculations, or other documentation generated by the city to check the city's math or to clarify how to review and validate submitted requests. We've seen Excel documents, lists, handwritten or typed calculations, basically any kind of scrap paper that you guys used in order to make your initial request really helps us when we're trying to move through the documentation and find what it is you're hoping that we find. Okay, so this is still in the document review stage. We're focusing specifically on scope of work on this slide. Scope of work can be found in your reimbursement request form, and it's meant to provide the following information. What is this request for? Why is it necessary? How is it COVID related? And finally, are there any known discrepancies between the request form and documentation that could use explanation? An example of a discrepancy like this that we've seen is maybe an employee gets a merit-based raise that's applied retroactively, but you're not requesting reimbursement for that raise. So their pay rate shows up differently in their supporting documentation than what you're reporting on the reimbursement request form. That's not an issue in and of itself, but we will have to reject it and send it back to you initially if you don't provide that explanation. So it's better to add more detail to the scope of work, basically. But these are the main parts, and as long as that's addressed, you should be fine. Okay, so this slide is about redacting supporting documentation. There are two main types of documentation that we're going to be going over. The purpose of this slide is to respond to basically slightly changed Treasury guidance on personally identifying information. It's changed slightly over the course of this program's lifetime. So the slide's intended to give a clearer view of what is currently required. So as I mentioned, there's two types of redaction that you need to keep in mind when you're looking through your supporting documentation. One is standard redaction of personally identifying information, which applies to everybody. So you should redact anything that's personally identifying besides basically a name and an employee ID number. So in the top right corner of the slide, you see an example of this. There's John Doe. What's been redacted has been home address, bank account number, and social security number. In the second category, this is not quite new, but new in the sense that it's now explicit. So in the bottom right corner, you see the same employee, John Doe, his kind of earnings information. And then above that, you see a heavily redacted section. And that is another employee whose pay is not being submitted for reimbursement. So any employee appearing in documentation whose pay is not being submitted for reimbursement needs to be fully redacted from any payroll information. Okay, we're moving on to the next stage of our approval process, which is matching requests